You know, when it comes to the genre of rock and roll, the media would say that Elvis Presley is the king of that. But most fans will argue and beg to differ and would say that there were some artists that was way better and talented than Elvis Presley around that time, like Little Richard, Fats Dominoes, even Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And black artists didn't call it rock and roll. They call it boogie woogie. That's what Ike Turner called it. But I would say that Elvis is one of the forefathers of rock and roll, even though he never wrote a song a day in his life. But if you ask that question to the Beatles, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and all of them great rock and roll acts, who's the greatest rock and roll king? They're gonna say Chuck Berry is the king. That's who influenced them. Chuck Berry said he never saw Elvis Presley as a rival, but more as a contemporary. He was just another artist changing the rock and roll scene. He also said Elvis just got more media exposure, and he understood that those in power looked more like Elvis Presley at that time. He knew the television stations were owned by whites. But all those artists, I named great musicians, but they all were influenced by Chuck Berry. The way he played the guitar, his style on stage, his songwriting, and everything. He was one of the first black crossover rock and roll artists. His music brought races together. He integrated musical styles. He was a businessman, smart businessman with his money. But the only problem Chuck Berry had, messing with them women. And he loved them white women. He would get into a lot of controversy messing with them women, man. And look, it was the 50s. This is the 50s and the 60s when racism was at a height. Chuck was wild. And he dealt with a lot of harassment and racism from police in his hometown, on the road. He did a lot of jail time. His story is crazy. The movie Cadillac Records only showcased a little bit about him, but some say he was a complicated man. But if they do that Chuck Berry movie biopic, it's gonna be a classic. I can't wait for that movie to come out. So let's get to a story, right? Now, Chuck Berry was born on October 18th, 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, he was the fourth born of 6 kids from his parents, Martha Berry, who was a school teacher, and his father, Henry Berry, was a repairman, contractor, and a deacon at their Baptist church. Now, growing up, ever since he was a toddler, Chuck said it, he said music was just in his blood, man. It was just in him. And, they was from the Ville, which was kind of considered a middle-class neighborhood for black people. The Ville at that time was segregated. It was like middle-class neighborhood of North St. Louis. Chuck said his neighborhood was so segregated that he didn't see a white person until he was about 3 years old, after seeing some white firefighters trying to put out a fire in his area. He thought their face was white because they were scared of the house fire. They was frightened of the house fire. Now, by the age of 6 years old, he started singing at church, and his parents could sing too. He said his father had a beautiful voice, very low. He led the bass section in the choir, and his mother would just sing all day. She just sang. But, around that time, it kind of got, it got rough for them, him and his family, because it was the Great Depression. And he would work with his father, doing whatever just to help out with the family, And also, let's not forget, it was the Jim Crow era, too. Racism was still high. Now, by the time he hit his teens, he really began to fall in love with the blues and was influenced by artists like, Nat King Cole was one of his favorite artists, T-Bone Walker, Rosetta Tharpe. He loved Muddy Waters, Little Walter, He loved Frank Sinatra music too, and Harry Belafonte, and many more artists at that time. He really loved, see, his thing was the big band era. Chuck really loved big band music. That's the music he really loved. But it wasn't just music he was in love with as a teen. He also got into photography, and he also wanted to be a comedian. He also knew Red Fox too from St. Louis. But once he got to high school, he ended up learning how to play the guitar from his friend named Ira Harris, who showed him some techniques on the guitar. And he went to Sumner High School, which was west of the Mississippi River. And it was the first high school for African Americans in St. Louis. And a lot of the other famous people went to that school, like, Tina Turner went there. Arthur Ashe, the tennis pro Arthur Ashe went there. Actor Robert Gilliam, who played Benson, he went there. And Dick Gregory went there. But, Chuck began to master the guitar and would take it everywhere with him. And he ended up winning the school talent show singing Jay McShann's song called Confessing the Blues. And once he won that contest, he knew music is really what he wanted to do. Now, also around that time, he had got a job as a DJ. He was a disc jockey and would play music at all the local dances in the neighborhood. And also, he played on the military base for all the black soldiers. But, as far as graduating high school, he ended up dropping out in the 11th grade. He started running with a bad crowd. And around 1944, when he was about 18 years old, he and two of his friends, they decided to drive to California. They wanted to go to Hollywood. They was trying to get away from St. Louis. But along the way, they ran out of money. They didn't have enough money. So they decided to hijack a car at gunpoint with an old gun that Chuck had found in the street somewhere in a parking garage or something. And they stuck up a bakery. They robbed a bakery, a barbershop, and a clothing store for some money. And they ended up getting caught and were arrested for armed robbery and were sent to prison for 10 years. Wow. Well, it was actually a reformatory for young men. Now in a reformatory, he and some of the black guys in the prison, they ended up forming a gospel singing group for Sunday church. And, Chuck also started boxing. He learned how to box in there. In 1947, after doing about 3 years in that reformatory, he was released on his 21st birthday for good behavior. And about a year later, he married Themetta Suggs and ended up working a bunch of jobs like, janitorial. He worked at an assembly plant. He worked with his father doing carpentry on the side. And he was also studying to be a hairdresser. He actually got a cosmetology degree and worked as a beautician. But, like I said earlier, music was in his heart. That was his first love. And, he started playing his guitar at some local spots to earn some money. And he started playing with some other local artists. And his popularity started to grow in the city. Then in 1953, pianist Johnny Johnson asked him to join his band called Sir John Trio. And, they would play country hillbilly music like Hank Williams and Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. But they would also do, songs by Nat King Cole and Muddy Waters too. Chuck would just mix the country music, the blues, and the R&B all together. And he would do all the singing. And the people used to go crazy when he would sing. That's when Johnny Johnson ended up making him the leader of the Sir John Trio band. They were the hottest band. They was the hottest band out alongside his rival, which was Ike Turner. He said him and Ike Turner were rivals at that time because, if you didn't know, 19-year-old Ike Turner had a #1 hit back in 1951 called Rocket 88, he wrote, but he didn't get the credit for it. But that's another story though. I'll save that story when I do Ike Turner's documentary. Because see, that Rocket 88 is considered to be the first rock and roll song. Well, we'll get into it with the Ike Turner story. But anyway, Chuck and his band, they started generating a buzz. And he decided to travel to Chicago because that's where a lot of the good music was being made at that time from Chess Records. They had that Chicago blues sound going on at that time. So once he got to Chicago around 1955, Chuck wanted to see all of his idols he'd been hearing on the radio. He went to a bunch of live music bars. He did end up seeing Howlin' Wolf and Elmore James, but then he ended up seeing and meeting his favorite artist, which was Muddy Waters, at a club. And he asked Muddy how could he make a record. And Muddy told him to go see Leonard Chess at Chess Records. And he told Chuck the street and everything, where he was at and everything. So he went to Chess Records. He met Leonard Chess. And Leonard had asked him if he had a demo of some original music, but Chuck told him it was back at his house in St. Louis, the original music. So he went back to St. Louis, got the demo tape, brought it back to Leonard Chess to hear. And Chuck did a cover of this hillbilly song called Ida Mae by Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys. But what Chuck did was create his own lyrics to it, though. He just changed the lyrics up. And when Leonard heard it, he was amazed how Chuck turned a hillbilly song into a black song. So, Leonard Chess had asked him to change the name Ida Red, and that's when they came up with the name Maybelline, after Leonard Chess spotted some mascara in the studio and suggested they call the song Maybelline. But, they changed the spelling to avoid a lawsuit from the cosmetics company. So Chuck ended up recording, about 5 songs that day. And afterwards, he signed a contract at Chess Records. And in July 1955, the song Maybelline was released. And it hit number 5 on the Billboard pop charts and number 1 on the R&B chart and sold over 1 million copies. That song became the first song to fuse country and the blues into what became known as rock and roll. Wow. The young white kids loved the song because what Chuck did was make a blues record at a fast tempo. That's all rock and roll is, y'all. A blues record at a fast tempo. It's just blues records sped up fast. And the teenagers loved it. That's when he realized that was his market, singing about teenage drag races, teenage young crushes and school days and things like that. But here's the crazy part, though. Now, when Chuck got a copy of the record, right, Maybelline, he saw 2 other names listed as writers above his, which was Alan Freed was one of them. Alan Freed was one of them names on there. That's when Chuck learned about payola, which is still going on in the music industry today. But at the time, he didn't mind, though, because you give something to Alan Freed, he was the machine. He had the power on a radio station to put your music on the airwaves and get heard by millions of people. And the song Maybelline was getting so many requests that Alan Freed was playing it on the radio all day and all night. But later on, Alan Freed, he did get in trouble with that payola, which, payola stands for payments from record companies to play specific records. And, Alan Freed got fired for that. And he was banned as a disc jockey for years, to his death. But anyway, so when Chuck started touring, the song Maybelline was out, he started touring. He said he had went to New York for the first time. That's when the first time he heard people say black people instead of saying Negro or colored people. Wow. He also said he noticed how the Apollo Theater was different from the white clubs because the blacks will boo you right off stage. They ain't like you. You better play something they like, he said. But it was also around that time in New York that people got to see for the first time he did his duck walk. He did his famous duck walk on stage. And Chuck said the duck walk, it came from when he was a child, when he would walk stooping with full bended knees, but with his back and his head vertical under a table. He tried to get a ball or something, and his family found it entertaining. He also said around that time, he's traveling through all the racist states, that really opened his eyes. But When he perform, when he would perform, the black and white kids would come together and show him love though. Even though they had a rope to separate them, one side for the black and the other side for the white. It was the older racist people that didn't like when the black and white kids would mingle and dance together. Plus, the kind of music he was doing would have the white kids reacting more because the song Maybelline was like a hillbilly type of song. But on the B side, he had the song called Wee Wee Hours, which was more of a blues song, and the people loved that song. But then he said he would go to some gigs where the whites responded more to the black music, which was the blues, while the blacks responded more to the white music, which was the hillbilly country music. And he dealt with a lot of racism. And look, he would show up to a gig and the security wouldn't even let him in because they didn't believe he was Chuck Berry. They thought Chuck Berry was a white man, just like the scene in the movie Cadillac Records. They wouldn't let him in. They couldn't believe that a black man was singing a hillbilly song like Maybelline. But as he continued to travel around the world, the shows started to integrate, and every race would just party together. In 1956, he released a song called Roll Over Beethoven, which hit number 2 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 29 on the pop chart. It also became a big hit for the Beatles years later. After they did a cover of it, John Lennon and Paul McCartney said that was one of their favorite songs. Now, in May 1957, he released his debut album titled After School Session, and that album included the songs Maybelline, Wee Wee Hours, Too Much Monkey Business, and many more. But one song everybody loved was called School Days, in which people considered a rock and roll anthem, and has been covered by so many artists from Elvis Presley. Even the Simpsons cartoon did it. But that same year, he released a single called Rock and Roll Music, which later became a #1 hit for the Beatles when they remade it. In March 1958, he released his second album titled One Dozen Berries, and the single called Sweet Little 16 hit #1 on the R&B bestsellers chart. Now, that same year, he released a song called Johnny Be Good, which hit #2 on the Hot R&B size chart and #8 on the Hot 100 chart, and is considered one of the most recognizable songs in the history of popular music. Wow. Everybody kind of knows that song because the Go Johnny Go, that phrase Go Johnny Go. Now, that same year, he opened up a club called Club Bandstand, which was named after American Bandstand. Chuck invested in a lot of things, man. Like he had a park, Berry Park. He had a movie theater, an apartment complex in Hollywood, and a bunch of other things. He was a very smart businessman. I give him that. He was very smart. In July 1959, he released his third album titled Chuck Berry Is on Top. He also starred in a movie called Go Johnny Go and was featured in a concert documentary called Jazz on a Summer's Day. But that same year, y'all, December 1959, he was arrested under the Mann Act law after allegations that he had sexual intercourse with a 14-year-old girl. Now, before I get to that incident, right, let's define what the Mann Act is, which was previously called the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. Now, the definition of the Mann Act is a federal law that criminalizes the transportation of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. And there were some other famous celebrities that were arrested under the Mann Act, like Charlie Chaplin and Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight boxing champion, and he was the first to be charged under that act. Jack Johnson was, wow, man. They tried to say Jack Johnson, the boxer, kidnapped Lucille Cameron, which was a white woman, even though the whole world knew they were a couple and eventually got married in 1912. But Really, they say the intent of the Mann Act was to punish black men for violating the norms of white society. They used it as a weapon of racism. But anyway, so Chuck Berry, he gets arrested under the Mann Act, right? So what happened was he had went to Mexico and he had stopped at a strip club there and was talking to some girls. Now, one of the girls was an Apache Indian waitress named Janice Escalante, who he thought was pretty. He said in his book, he said he thought she was pretty, but her clothes looked kind of homely. And she had told him she was 21 years old. But she did tell him that she had just gotten out of prison and she used to prostitute. So Chuck gets this idea of having her work as a hostess and a hat girl in his club back in St. Louis. So he brings her to his club to work. He let her stay in his old house. He was having sex with her the whole time since they first met back in Mexico and everything. And so once she starts working there for a while, her and Chuck ended up not seeing eye to eye, and he fired the girl. He fired her, and he tried to send her back to El Paso, Texas. But she wanted him to send her to Arizona on a bus. And when he didn't send her to Arizona, that's when she started hooking and prostituting at a hotel right by his club. And she ended up getting caught up by the police there. And that's when she told the police everything about Chuck. She told the police everything, how he repeatedly had sex with her while they was on a road, including in the back of his Cadillac a lot of times. And plus, she was only 14 years old. Wow. And that's when they arrested Chuck, and he had to go to trial. And, he was found guilty of transporting her just 2 days before Christmas, and he was fined $5,000. They fined him $5,000, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for that. And Chuck, he just lost it, man. He started crying in front of everybody in the court. And, the judge showed no sympathy for him, man. The judge he faced was a real racist. And all through the trial, he never called Chuck by his real name. He referred to Chuck as the Negro. The judge told Chuck this. He told Chuck that he wasn't going to let him loose to go out and prey on a lot of ignorant Indian girls and colored girls and white girls, if any. He said he would not have that on his soul. Wow. Now, Chuck and his lawyers appealed the decision, claiming that the judge's comments and attitude were racist and prejudiced, which influenced the all-white jury against them. So that case was thrown out because the judge's comments, so they had to do another trial. But he lost the second trial too. But instead of getting 5 years in prison, they gave him a 3-year prison sentence. It's crazy because there were a lot of stars that messed with a lot of underage girls that didn't get in trouble or go to jail. Like, of course, Elvis Presley. He was 24 years old when he met his wife Priscilla when she was 14 years old. Singer Jerry Lee Lewis, he was 22 years old when he married his 13-year-old cousin while he was still married to another woman. But anyway, Chuck just dealt with a lot of trouble messing with them young girls, and especially white women. Because 3 months before that, before he met the 14-year-old Indian girl, he was arrested in Kansas City after a state trooper pulled him over with a 17-year-old French white girl. That was another Mann Act charge involving transporting, but he beat that case because the white girl told the judge that she was in love with Chuck Berry. Another incident, messing with the white women and everything. Another incident was when some white guys at a fraternity in Mississippi tried to hurt him after they accused him of kissing one of the white guy's sisters or something like that. The white girl told the police that Chuck had asked her for a date, and he ended up being charged for disturbing the peace because he caused such havoc. They was trying to get to him. So he was charged with disturbing the peace, and That was later settled. He had to spend a night in jail, and he had to give up the $700 that he had in his pocket. So he got out of that. And look, before all of that with the white woman, before he even became famous, he had an affair with a white neighbor who lived right above him. You know, the wife was downstairs, sleep, whatever. He up there with the white woman. And look, and police had threatened to knock his head off with a baseball bat at that time when they brought him to the station. And another incident, right, when he was in jail, the first time in the reformatory, he was accused of messing with the jail superintendent wife. Wow. Like I said, his father always told him, don't mess with them white women. So now in prison, you know, he would use his time wisely though. He educated himself, got his GED, learned how to type, studied business law, business management, accounting, American history. And, you know, he became a physical therapy secretary in that prison too. And on October 18th, 1963, he was released from prison after having spent 20 months incarcerated from that Mann Act charge. So now out of prison, he noticed how the people overseas loved his music because the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and all of them were remaking a lot of his songs. They remade a lot of his songs, and it was becoming very popular all across the world. The British invasion had taken over the USA when he got out of prison. So in August 1964, he released his sixth album, which was a collaboration album with Bo Diddley called Two Great Guitars. Months later, that same year in 1964, he released his seventh solo album called St. Louis to Liverpool. You know, he wanted to capitalize off that British invasion that the Beatles had brought to America. That British invasion was making Chuck even more popular because they was all copying his music. They was copying his music, Muddy Waters and them, Little Walter and all that. The Beatles, man, were so influenced by Chuck, they did a cover of his song called Roll Over Beethoven, Rock and Roll Music, and other songs years later that became hits. The Rolling Stones too, they did a lot of his stuff too. The first single they did was called Come On, and they did a lot of other stuff years later too. And plus, you know, the Beach Boys, their number one hit song called Surfing USA was basically Chuck Berry's song called Sweet Little 16. They basically just changed the lyrics, but, you know, they had to give Chuck writing credits for that. They also stole the opening guitar solo to his song Johnny Be Good for their song called Fun, Fun, Fun. Now, in 1965, you know, he released two albums. The first one was called Chuck Berry in London, in which he recorded a lot of those songs while he was in London. And the second album was called Fresh Berries. In 1966, he ended up leaving Chess Records, and he signed with Mercury Records, and they wanted him to re-record all of his songs he did on Chess Records, but they just wanted him to record it at a faster tempo. In March 1967, he released his 10th album titled Chuck Berry's Golden Hits. Around 1969, he finally ended up meeting Little Richard because, you know, they was both booked to do a show together at a school in Connecticut, right? So Chuck said he knew Little Richard was gay. He knew Little Richard was gay because when he met him back in the dressing room, he didn't see no girls around him. He just had a bunch of men. And, you know, he said he tried to give Little Richard a handshake, but Little Richard grabbed him and hugged him real tight. Chuck crazy. And, you know, Little Richard told him to come to his hotel room to party. And Chuck responded saying, "What you mean? Just us two? What, to make love or something?" And Little Richard told him, "Yeah." Little Richard told him, "Yeah, you'll love it. It's like no other performance in the world." Wow. Little Richard was off the chain, man. Chuck said he just smiled, slid out of there, and said, "I gotta go do a show or something." Now, in 1970, you know, he ended up going back to Chess Records. He signed a record deal back with them. And, you know, that same year, he released the album called Back Home. In 1972, he released the album titled The London Chuck Berry Sessions, in which he got that idea to record in London after seeing Howlin' Wolf record his album there called The London Howlin' Wolf Sessions. And more and Muddy Waters did the same thing too that year in 1972. But on that London Chuck Berry Sessions album, he had a song called My Ding-a-Ling, which hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 single chart, becoming his only #1 song in the United States. But you know the title, My Ding-a-Ling, caused a lot of controversy. And a lot of people, they tried to get it banned. Then, Chess Records ended up filing for bankruptcy and was bought by All Platinum Records, which was owned by Joe and Sylvia Robinson, who would later, Joe and Sylvia Robinson would later on start the first hip-hop label called Sugar Hill Records. Here's something crazy, right? In 1977, Chuck Berry's song called Johnny Be Good, was included on a golden disc and sent to space with the Voyager mission. NASA had launched 2 spacecrafts, the Voyager 1 and 2, to explore planets like Jupiter, Saturn, and others, and the spacecrafts carried a 12-inch gold-plated record that contained music, sounds, and images picked to represent the great diversity of life on Earth. The whole idea was maybe one day extraterrestrial life far away would stumble across the record and learn something from us. Wow. So if aliens or whatever one day just happen to stumble across the spacecraft, or people 300 or 400 or 500 years later find the spacecrafts, they would hear Chuck Berry's music. Wow. That's crazy. In 1979, he did a show and performed on the lawn of the White House for President Jimmy Carter and his family. But, right after that same year in 1979, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison for tax evasion. Apparently, he had $200,000 worth of unpaid taxes. That just came back to haunt him because, Chuck did a lot of gigs being paid under the table. And in court, he broke down crying. Plus they gave him 1,000 hours of community service, in which he completed that. He completed that by performing and doing benefit concerts. So, he got to prison. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison. So in prison for about 120 days, he had brought his guitar though, writing materials. He got 2 dictionaries with him in his cell, and he started writing his autobiography. And he will also perform songs for the inmates in prison. And once he got out around November 1979, he released his 19th album titled Rocket on a new label called Atco Records, who was in business with Atlantic Records at the time. Now, when the 80s came around, he mainly just toured the U.S., playing up to like 100 shows a year by himself. Just him and his guitar, because he got rid of his band, so he wouldn't have to pay them. When he would get a gig, he would tell the promoters or whoever booked the show, find local musicians to back him up on stage. Plus, it was their responsibility to pay them. Chuck won't pay nobody nothing. In 1980, he opened a Southern Air restaurant located in Wentzville, Missouri. In 1982, he appeared in a movie called National Lampoon's Class Reunion. In 1984, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. In 1986, he became the first person inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Wow, he was the first, y'all. And there was other artists on the bill that night that was inducted too, like James Brown was inducted, Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Little Richard, Fat Dominoes, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers they were also inducted that night. And like I said earlier, man, Chuck wanted promoters to pay him in cash. One time he showed up to a show in Syracuse. He pulled out a briefcase and the promoter gave him $20,000 in cash, all hundreds. And plus he was late to the show because he didn't want to pay to get on the plane. He drove instead. He drove to save money. They say Chuck was he was cheap. He was cheap now. Chuck was cheap. I don't blame him though. Chuck had rules. His rules were there will be no performance unless payment has been received in full cash. Look, Chuck, he ain't want no limousines, no drivers. You had to get him a Lincoln Town car, and he would prefer to drive himself while on tour. Plus, the opening, this is the other rule he had. The opening band may not mention the name Chuck Berry during the set. Wow. Now, in 1987, he released a documentary called Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, which was directed by Oscar-nominated director Taylor Hackford and produced by Chuck and Rolling Stones member Keith Richards. And the documentary was basically about two 1986 concerts he had did, which also celebrated his 60th birthday. But what's crazy is during one of those concerts in 1986, which was in New York, Chuck and Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones had got into an argument on stage because Chuck felt Keith Richards was doing too much and messing up his tunes, even though Keith Richards was the musical director of the documentary. Chuck wanted to play lead on his songs while singing. You know, they say when you deal with Chuck Berry, there's going to be conflict and tension. He has his way of doing things, which is only his way. Now, another incident between him and Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, right? Chuck ended up punching him in the face too. Chuck punched him in the face because Keith Richards touched his guitar while he wasn't there. Wow. You know, they say Chuck had beat up singer Jerry Lee Lewis too one night backstage after he kept saying the N-word several times in his presence. Like I said, Chuck used to box in prison, y'all, so don't get it twisted. He used to box. He took up boxing. But that same year in 87, Chuck was charged with assaulting a woman at a hotel in New York. Now, the woman said that she dated Chuck and claimed he violently and forcefully hit her in the face with his fist, causing her 2 loose teeth, and she needed 5 stitches to close the cut. And, you know, she was suing him for $5 million for her severe, serious, and permanent personal injuries, and also caused her extreme emotional distress and severe emotional and mental anxiety. And he was charged with assault but failed to appear in court, which led to a bench warrant for his arrest. But he ended up pleading guilty 11 months later to a lesser charge of harassment, and he had to pay like a $250 fine. Now, that same year in 87, a videotape came out of Chuck Berry. I don't know if I can't say this. They might flag this. He was doing some all over this unidentified woman. Bunch of crazy stuff. Look it up. Hey, yo, Chuck Berry was wild. There's a videotape of him doing R. Kelly type stuff. Put it that way. Now, in 1988, Maybelline was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame for its influence as a rock and roll record. That same year, he also released his autobiography book after 8 years of working on that. In December 1989, here we go, a former cook, you know, at his restaurant, the Southern Air restaurant, and several other women, they filed a lawsuit against him, claiming that he had installed a video camera in the bathroom of his restaurant. Now, the former cook said that he had made videotapes of her changing clothes in the bathroom and using the toilet. But then a big class action lawsuit by 200 female employees and customers was filed against him for causing distress and humiliation. The women were claiming that he had installed hidden cameras in the ladies' restroom and videotaped the women without their knowledge at the restaurant and at his park. I told y'all he had invested in a park too. Now, the lawsuit alleged that the videotapes were created for the improper purpose of entertainment and gratification of Chuck Berry's sexual fetishes. But that suit was settled out of court. The suit was settled out of court, and Chuck paid the women an estimated $1.2 million. That same year, he was arrested over a drug raid on his estate in Wentzville, Missouri. Now, that story goes about that incident, right? A search warrant was issued by a circuit judge after allegations claimed that 9 million of Chuck Berry's $36 million in liquid assets was obtained through drug sales. They try to say that police for some time had suspected him of transporting large loads of cocaine in his guitar case as part of a multi-million-dollar drug operation. Wow. So when they searched his house, they found only 2 ounces of weed, some hash, 2 rifles, and a shotgun, as well as more than $122,000 in cash. You know, by him being a convicted felon, he was barred from possessing firearms. But here's the other thing that the cops found. They found a bunch of pornographic videotapes, photographic slides, and books, and they say some of which appeared to show underage girls. And Chuck did speak to the media saying, Chuck said he never used cocaine in his life. And he ended up being charged with the marijuana possession and 3 counts of child abuse for underage porn. But Chuck ended up suing the county prosecutor, accusing him of filing malicious and political motivated charges. And he later cut a no jail plea deal in which the child abuse charges were dismissed and he dropped his civil case. So basically the child abuse charges were eventually dropped, and Chuck agreed to plead guilty to misdemeanor possession of marijuana and was given a 6-month suspended jail sentence, placed on 2 years unsupervised probation, and was ordered to donate $5,000 to a local hospital. Then right after that, his recording studio caught on fire, which took about 50 firefighters to bring under control. But after that, in the 90s, Chuck would just tour the world, work on music. So when the 2000s came, that's when his former pianist, Johnny Johnson, who was part of his, the band for years, they had stopped working together. He actually tried to sue. He tried to sue Chuck because he claimed he co-wrote over 50 songs with Chuck Berry, but didn't get no credit. But that case was dismissed when the judge ruled that too much time had passed since the songs was written. In 2003, his motel called the Old Chuck Berry Lodge on his property was intentionally set on fire. There was arson on that. I don't know if they ever found the person that did that. Now, in 2008, the classic movie called Cadillac Records, that's my movie right there, was released, featuring Beyonce as Etta James, Columbus Short as Little Walter, and rapper Mos Def played Chuck Berry. Now, Mos Def said he had to prepare to play the role of Chuck Berry without getting to meet him because Chuck was on tour at the time. He was 82 years old at that time too. But he did study a lot of his footage from interviews and documentaries on the internet and everything. So that's how he prepared for that role of Chuck Berry. In 2011, during a concert on New Year's Day in Chicago, Chuck had passed out and had to be helped off stage. They say he was suffering from exhaustion. But also that same year, he was honored by his hometown in St. Louis with the dedication of an 8-foot tall statue, even though some people petitioned to block the statue because of his past. Now, the following year, in 2012, his house got robbed in St. Louis by 3 men who stole one of his electric guitars. They stole some power washers, used car batteries. They took part of his fence and some other items. They stole his fence. That's crazy. But those 3 men ended up getting arrested for that. In 2017, at 90 years old, he started working on a new album called Chuck, which was his first new album in 38 years. But on March 18th, 2017, Chuck Berry died from cardiac arrest. They say his estate at the time was worth $50 million, including $17 million in music rights, and his music publishing accounted for $13 million of the estate's value. Plus, he had $250 million in real estate. Wow. Told you, man, Chuck was a businessman. And a lot of people came to the funeral to pay their respects, like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, Gene Simmons of the rock and roll band Kiss, Little Richard was there, and many more. And, Chuck was buried with his cherry red Gibson ES 335 guitar bolted to the inside lid of his coffin. You know something? Through all the controversies of him being accused with dealing with all those women, going to jail for all that, the women stuff, his wife stuck by his side. She stuck by his side, y'all. They've been together for over 70 years. Wow. And that last album he was working on, called Chuck, was released on June 9th, 2017. And you want to look, there's a lot of books out about Chuck Berry's life. And I'm sure that a movie is in the works. A movie gotta be in the works about his life. It's too crazy not to be told. There's a documentary called Chuck Berry, the Original King of Rock and Roll, on YouTube. I recommend y'all check out too. That was very good. The Cadillac Records movie only showed a little portion about his life. They ain't showed nothing. That was more based on Muddy Waters' life and Leonard Chess. This little story I'm doing right here is nothing. It's so much more to his story, man. It's crazy. I couldn't even put it in. And a lot of stuff I ain't want to get flagged for, but anyway, Chuck Berry was 90 years old. 90 years old. Rest in peace, the king of rock and roll, Chuck Berry.